We're very fortunate to have Ray Dorsey here, and if you have questions for Ray Dorsey, please let us know. And if we have some pre questions that were sent earlier, but I'm asking Ray a few questions, and then we'll open the floor to more questions for Ray. Ray, thanks so much for joining us tonight. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Is my level there? Is my level there working, Angela?
Yes.
Great.
I think we're seeing the battery.
Oh, that's good. Thank you. I'm good. Ray, how did this book come about?
So first, before I answer how this book came about, I want to thank Carl and Angela very much for inviting me here. They're also featured in chapter 4 of the book, so it's a real delight. Carl and Angela have been pioneers, champions for change, authors, and have galvanized the Parkinson's community. And it's people like Carl and Angela and all of you here who will change the course of the disease, not neurologists, the people who change the course of diseases, whether that's polio, whether that's drinking and driving, whether it's HIV, or people most directly affected by the disease. So happy to be here. So why we write the book? So Parkinson's is one of the world's fastest growing brain diseases. In 1990, it's estimated 2.6 million people had the disease. Today, the estimate's 11.8 million.
Better diagnosed.
Not just necessarily better diagnosed. So conditions that we do diagnose better, like multiple sclerosis, aren't growing nearly as fast as Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's is growing faster than anything else, even diseases for which we have much better tests. And this rise in Parkinson's disease is not a natural consequence of aging. Not a natural consequence of aging. It is an unnatural consequence. And when we look at this growth, Michael Okun and I say, well, who's responsible for responding to this? And I think the uncomfortable answer is that we are. And if Parkinson's is the fastest growing brain disease, or one of the fastest growing brain diseases, and I'm a nice Parkinson's specialist, why am I not doing more to help end it? So Michael and I share your frustrations. Carl said at dinner today, you like when I get a little pissed off. So I probably hate Parkinson's disease almost as much as all of you do. And we put together a plan to help prevent, slow, treat, and end the disease. And that's what the book is. It gives you individual recommendations to help slow the rate of progression. It gives you recommendations so your kids don't have to get the disease, and so that our generation can be the last to bear the burden of Parkinson's disease. Diseases come and go. There was a world without smallpox until we had cities. There was a world with polio, and now there's a world without. There was a world with something called cancer of the scrotum. Now cancer of the scrotum, you have a better chance of getting cancer. You have a better chance of getting struck by lightning than getting cancer of the scrotum. Bleeding ulcers used to be a leading cause of death in the United States. Now bleeding ulcers are almost all but gone. Diseases can come and diseases can go, and we give you a plan to help make Parkinson's go away.
Is any place safe of Parkinson's?
Any place safe?
Yes.
So if you look at the map of Parkinson's disease, it's not uniform. If Parkinson's disease were just due to genetics, it should just follow the genetic distribution of genes. It doesn't. If Parkinson's disease were just due to aging, you would just expect areas of the country or areas of the world with lots of older individuals to have higher rates and areas of the world not. It isn't. When you look at the map adjusted for age, there's like a 5-fold variation. Areas of the world that are heavily industrialized, like the US and Canada, have the highest rates of the disease. Areas of the world that are least industrialized, that have historically had the least pesticide use, cleaner air, cleaner water, like sub-Saharan Africa, have the lowest rates of the disease. And areas of the world undergoing the most rapid industrialization, like India and China, have the fastest increasing rates of the disease.
How about the Berbers in Morocco?
So there are some rare genetic forms of the disease. So let's talk about the genes. So there was a great study done by the Parkinson's Foundation called PD generation. Probably a handful of you might even participated in the study. And so this great study offered free genetic counseling and genetic testing to anyone with Parkinson's disease. And they've enrolled tens of thousands of individuals with it. And they looked at the data from the first 8,000 individuals, largely Americans. Of those 8,000 individuals, 12.5% carry a genetic cause or risk factor for the disease. 12.5% carry a genetic cause or risk factor. So another way, 87% of Americans with Parkinson's have no known genetic cause or risk factor for the disease. The cause of the disease lies not within us, it lies outside of us. The principal causes of Parkinson's disease are chemicals in our food, water, and air. If we get rid of these chemicals, we get rid of Parkinson's. If you are not exposed to these chemicals in your food, water, and air, you have extraordinarily unlikely to ever develop Parkinson's disease. You put a laboratory mouse in the lab and you let it age, it does not spontaneously develop Parkinson's disease. The only way that mouse gets Parkinson's disease is if you manipulate its genes, and only 12.5% of people carry a genetic cause or risk factor. And the vast majority of those individuals will never develop Parkinson's disease, by the way. Or you have to expose it to toxins. Tanner and Webb Ross did a study and showed that high milk consumers in Hawaii had higher rates of Parkinson's disease.
Going up the vagus nerve, probably, right?
Higher rates of Parkinson's disease. They looked at their brains. They had fewer dopamine producing nerve cells, which are lost in Parkinson's disease. And they found the residue of that pesticide, L-peptachlor, in milk consumers with Parkinson's disease in Hawaii.
So we can test them on rats now instead of using terraform.
Yes, Bob, we gotta let me finish, so then we'll get you lots of questions, I promise. Thank you.
What about the microbiome?
We'll get there.
Our microbiomes are different.
I know, we're
according to
gonna.
Van Helmont.
Hey guys, can you repeat the Mediterranean diet answer one more time?
Sure.
We did have an audio cutout.
Sure.
And a lot of people were interested on Zoom about that.
So the Mediterranean diet, high in fruits and vegetables, low in animal products, appears to slow the rate of progression of the disease and may protect individuals from ever developing it, likely in part due to certain pesticides and chemicals get concentrated as they move up the food chain, as they move up to, like, for example, cows and other animals that we eat, and people who eat these animals may have higher exposure to these chemicals. So eating organic, not just produce, but organic dairy products and organic meat would be advisable too.
I had this talk with Dr. Okun, and he pretty much told me that the Parkinson's disease is kind of a misnomer, that it's more different with their cause, with their on the scale of symptoms.
Yeah, so when Dr. Parkinson described the condition, he naturally thought it was a brain disease. But in 2003, a very smart German pathologist named Heiko Brock said that when he looks at the brains of individuals with Parkinson's disease, he finds the pathology first in the nerve that goes to the gut, called the vagus nerve. So it's the nerve that goes from this lower part of your brain stem, all the way down to your gut. So it can be 2 to 3 feet in length, depending on how tall you are. Or you find it first in the smell center. So he said the origins of Parkinson's disease actually don't begin in the brain. He thought that they began in the gut. And he thought that there might be a virus, kind of like polio. We consume, polio spreads from poor hand washing and drinking water that's contaminated. He thought perhaps we were eating a virus that would then spread the pathology of Parkinson's disease up the vagus nerve and into the higher parts of the brain that control movement, and later the parts of the brain that control thinking. In 2019, my colleague, Dr. Per Borghammer in Denmark, said there are 2 forms of Parkinson's disease and dementia with Lewy bodies, but 2 forms of Parkinson's disease. One form that begins in the gut, and it ascends up the vagus nerve, and one form that begins in the nose and then spreads backwards. And I thought this was fantastic. I printed out all his papers, read them, marked them up, read them over the weekend, and I emailed them and I said, dear Dr. Borghammer, outstanding work. Do you think that the pathology that begins in the gut could happen from toxins or chemicals that we ingest, that we eat? ascending up, and that the nose or brain first form of the disease could be from chemicals that we inhaling pesticides from living near a golf course, pesticides from living near a farm, or from outdoor air pollution. He was skeptical at first, but we wrote a paper called The Body, the Brain, the Environment, and Parkinson's Disease, in which we postulated that chemicals that we ingest like certain pesticides can lead to a body or gut first form of the disease, and chemicals that we inhale could lead to a brain or nose first form of the disease.
Is there any way of testing whether testing of whether it's been ingested or whether it's breathed?
Yeah, so can you tell if someone starts in the gut or in the brain? I think you probably can. This is more speculative. So many of you know one of the earliest symptoms of Parkinson's disease, well before tremor develops, is constipation. So that might be an early signal that people are having a gut first form of the disease. It turns out that the gut is innervated from both sides of the brain. So the vagus nerve, the left vagus nerve, you just like you have a left hand and right hand, you have a left vagus nerve and you have a right vagus nerve. And it turns out that the gut gets innervation from both the left vagus nerve and the right vagus nerve.
Does the gut have neurons in the enteric nervous system?
Yeah, so the vagus nerve connects to the nerves in the gut, and that people with a gut form of Parkinson's might have more symmetric Parkinson's disease. Once it gets to the vagus nerve, it then goes to part of the brain that's responsible for acting out your dreams. So people with a gut form of the disease might have early REM sleep behavior disorder and early in their course of disease, then more symmetric Parkinsonism, not quite as much asymmetry as some people have. And then those individuals tend to have a little bit more difficulties with thinking. Some people know about dementia with Lewy bodies, for example, might be a gut first form. People who inhale it, one of the earliest features may be loss of smell. You know, that's a little bit complicated, but maybe loss of smell that precedes the tremor. Because 99% of the nerve cells connect to the same side of the brain, only 1% cross over to the other side of the brain. It tends to be very asymmetric disease. It tends to have early tremor and slowness in movement. It tends to only later have sleep disturbances, only later to have constipation, and only much, much, much later have a significant cognitive impairment. You need to affect both sides of the brain to get a lot of problems with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So with that also connects, I've noticed a lot of people have very sensitive guts as far as the way they take their meds, and they have to very carefully time them.
I don't think so. I think that levodopa is an amino acid,
Right.
and when you eat proteins are just chains of amino acids, and so I think that's likely that when you eat protein, that competes for absorption.
Also, some people can't get it out of the gut.
I guess what I'm getting at is some of my friends really have to monitor that.
Yeah.
And I'm not affected by that.
Yeah, I think it tends to be later in the course of disease, it tends to be more problematic. Oh, and I'm sorry, I should repeat the question. This was answer to the question was, does the gut versus brain, gut form versus brain first form of the disease have anything to do with taking your medications, and some people having to be very careful about what they eat before they take their medicine, and others being able to get away with less strict? Probably not. I think it's probably more a function of how long you've had the disease. I could be wrong.
You spoke. You mentioned in the book that we're facing a pandemic. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So Dr. Michael Okun, in one of his early books in 2012-13, said that we have a Parkinson's pandemic, and Boss Bloom and I wrote a paper called "The Parkinson Pandemic," which resonated with many of you and actually helped motivate us to write our first book, Ending Parkinson's Disease. So what is a pandemic? So historically, we think of pandemics as due to infectious diseases, bubonic plague and Black Death, smallpox, influenza pandemic in 1918. So if you say that pandemics are only infectious diseases, then probably, Parkinson's is not likely an infectious disease for the vast majority of people. But it turns out that we live in a world not affected so much by infectious diseases, but by chronic conditions: diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. And the vectors of these chronic conditions, which are growing rapidly and are found all over the world, aren't infectious diseases. They're not viruses. The vectors are ultra-processed food, soft drinks, pesticides, industrial air pollution. So the vectors aren't of these new pandemics: pandemic of obesity, pandemic of diabetes, pandemic of Parkinson's. These aren't infectious, but due to chemicals in our food, water, and air, or changes in our dietary patterns. Like other pandemics, Parkinson's is growing rapidly. Like other pandemics, it spread from different parts. So it started, for example, in England, when Dr. Parkinson described 6 people with the condition, and now 200 years after he described 6 people, 6 million people have it, right? So what goes from 6 to 6 million in 200 years? It can't be genetic, right? Our genes don't change that much. And we didn't all of a sudden get really old really fast in 200 years, right? So if you look at the spread of it, if you look at the rapid growth, and if you look at the vectors of it, if you define that none of us are immune to Parkinson's disease, as far as we know, none of us are necessarily immune for the vast majority of us, it shares all the characteristics of a traditional pandemic. The only difference is that the vectors aren't infectious. They are chemicals in our environment.
Well, when I was diagnosed almost 40 years ago, they said that there was a rumor that possibly Parkinson's can be communicable. Is there any evidence of that?
So there was a concern to Parkinson's be spread from one person to another. There are some viruses that can contribute to Parkinson's. Some people might know West Nile virus, for example, can lead to Parkinsonism. But lots of studies have been looking at, for example, blood transfusions from people with Parkinson's to people without. And there's no evidence that Parkinson's is transmissible. There is, some of you remember that that Parkinson's disease, that we did trial stem cells with Parkinson's, and so they put the stem cells into the brains of people with Parkinson's, hope that those stem cells could produce the dopamine that's lost in the disease. It largely did not work. There are attempts to retry that therapy. But it turned out that those stem cells, that the healthy stem cells that were put in there, they became diseased, and they actually had the pathology of Parkinson's, these Lewy bodies found in the transplanted cells, suggesting that the pathology of Parkinson's, it can't spread from person to person, but within the nervous system, it can spread from the vagus nerve up to the parts of the brain that are affected with Parkinson's, and then up to the cortex, the outer parts of the brain that are responsible for thinking. So we have really, really good evidence that Parkinson's disease is due to a misfolded protein, and that misfolded protein in some individuals spreads from the gut up the vagus nerve to the higher parts of the brain, or in the majority of people with Parkinson's, likely from their nose back to different parts of the brain. And so the pathology itself spreads, and that's also why the exposure you might have had for Parkinson's wasn't yesterday, last year, or even 10 years ago. It might be 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, because it takes time for this whole pathological process to spread and for enough nerve cells to die off the system. So the seeds of Parkinson's are planted early. In some cases, when you're 10 or 11 years old, like in some cases, Brian Grant, the former NBA basketball player, was a 3-year-old boy when he was living at the secluded base Camp Lejeune and was exposed to it. I have spoken to people I spoke to a woman whose father was at Camp Lejeune, and he developed Parkinson's. She was conceived at Camp Lejeune, never born there, and developed Parkinson's disease. The seeds of this disease are planted early. If you guys think about it, my guess is some of you drank well water when you were a kid. Anyone drink well water when they were a kid? Right? So that was well water, not regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act, prone to pesticides, likely in rural areas, prone to contamination from pesticides from nearby farms, and so you're drinking it and you're leading to a gut first form.
Why don't the animals get it?
We'll get to that in a second. And gut first form of the disease. Other of you might have worked with trichloroethylene when you were a teenager or in your 20s. Anyone work with trichloroethylene there 19 and 20? And you could have been breathing in the chemical then, and then 30 years later, you get the disease. The Camp Lejeune, does anyone know about Camp Lejeune? Anyone knows about Camp Lejeune? No. So Camp Lejeune is a Marine base in North Carolina. It's one of the largest Marine bases in the country. And the Marines, if you're a young Marine, you either go get trained in Camp Lejeune or you get in Camp Pendleton. And for 25 years, from 1953 to 1987, Camp Lejeune was contaminated with this chemical. It's called trichloroethylene, used in dry cleaning. Points out 6 atoms, 2 carbons, 1 hydrogen in white, and 3 chlorine atoms, hence its name trichloroethylene. It's got a close related cousin called perchloroethylene, got 1 more chlorine atom. Per just means 4. And if you're dry cleaning your clothes, you're likely getting exposed to perchloroethylene. And so the Marine base there was contaminated by a dry cleaner and other contaminations from 1953 to 1987, up to 3,000 times the safe level of the chemical. And the Marines who served there, my colleagues, Dr. Caroline Tanner and Sam Goldman, studied the Marines who served there versus the Marines who served at Camp Pendleton. And they found that 33 years later, Marines who served at Camp Lejeune had a 70% increased risk of developing Parkinson's.
And leukemia and all kinds of.
And it causes cancer too. Now, the Marines, what's the average age of a Marine doing training?
20.
20, exactly. How long do Marines hang out at a service base? 2 years. So yet 33 years later, they had a 70% higher risk of Parkinson's. So the seeds of Parkinson's are planted early. If you don't want your kids, you don't want your grandkids to get Parkinson's, look at our Parkinson's 25. We give you it so that your generation is the last to bear the burden of the disease and that your kids and grandkids can live lives free of Parkinson's disease. We got a Zoom question on audiences. So
Yes.
before they're going to kill me.
Off the tangent, but question. Does medication, L-DOPA help with the gut form of Parkinson's?
So in the 1960s, they looked at brains of people with Parkinson's and they found them to be low in dopamine. And so the initial doctors, simplistic thing, we'll give people dopamine, but that caused them to vomit and wasn't well tolerated. Then they gave levodopa, which gets converted in the brain back to the dopamine that's lost, highly effective. It appears to be highly effective for almost all forms of Parkinson's disease. Now, some of you may have dementia with Lewy bodies, and it appears in that case, people have Parkinsonism, slowness of movement, tremor, difficulty walking, early cognitive difficulties, and hallucinations. And levodopa appears to be less beneficial for those individuals, but almost still worth a try, but appears to work for both forms. Do we want to take questions now, or when do you want to take questions? Okay, sure, yes, ma'am.
Sorry, I understand the relationship between environmental factors, pesticides, et cetera, and Parkinson's, but there have been cases of Parkinson's that are more acute cases, but particularly trauma. You comment on that, and that's something that presents the same as Parkinson's that we think is caused by.
You said trauma? So the question was, what about acute forms of Parkinsonism? So so in general, Parkinson's comes on slowly. In 1983 or 87, young people in their 30s developed acute onset of what looked like Parkinson's disease. And this was described by Dr. Bill Langston and Santa Clara Valley Hospital. And it turned out those individuals were using a street form of heroin, injecting it that had been contaminated with a chemical called MPTP. The frozen addicts, and it went into their bloodstream and it got transported into their brain. Instead of developing Parkinson's disease years after the exposure or decades, they developed days after it. Yeah. That's the classic form of acute, and that chemical has bears a striking structural resemblance to paraquat, the weed killer that's linked to Parkinson's disease. In general, even people who've gotten repeated head trauma, like Muhammad Ali, their onset has been slow. And from just head trauma increases your risk of Parkinson's disease. Repeated head trauma certainly increases your risk for Parkinson's disease, but even then it appears to be slow or insidious in onset. And then infectious causes, so we talked about West Nile, things can have shorter duration. in the 1918s, 1920s, people got a sleeping sickness shortly after the influenza pandemic. Some developed an acute onset of Parkinsonism. Some later developed it. If you ever saw the movie Awakenings, this is Robin Williams acting as Oliver Sacks and using levodopa to treat these individuals who had an infection in their brain called encephalitis. But the vast majority of people with Parkinson's have a slow, insidious onset. And I think for the vast majority of people, this has been playing out for years, if not decades, or even generations.
Why do people who are exposed to the same neurotoxin react?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So why do some individuals exposed to a chemical get the disease and some don't? So only 10% of smokers get lung cancer. So the vast majority of smokers don't get lung cancer.
So how long do they live?
Some live like
Maybe they die before they.
I'm never gonna let me finish. So it varies, but there are smokers who are alive at 90 and 100, and there are people who die in their 40s or 50s. So there have to be other factors. So in the book, we give you 3 factors for what determines who might develop the disease and who might not. One is the exposure. So what was the dose of the exposure? What was the duration of the exposure? What was the route of the exposure? I don't know, that inhaled is more dangerous, for example, than ingested or skin, for example. And what was the timing? So when were they exposed? If they were exposed at a young age, the same amount of chemical to a young child is going to have a much bigger effect than that same amount to an adult, for example. And kids have a developing brain. Like the woman who's conceived, right? She has no blood-brain barrier to protect herself. These chemicals, many are small enough they can cross the placenta. Some dissolve in fat. They're found in breast milk from a nursing woman and can be fed to the babies. So that's exposure is one factor. Second is interactions. So it turns out, for example, pesticides and head trauma amplify your risk of the disease. It's not 1 + 1 = 2, it's 1 + 1 = 3. Also, people who carry genetic risk factor, GBA is the most common genetic risk factor for Parkinson's. About 8% of individuals carry this genetic mutation. Those individuals appear to be much more susceptible to the adverse effects of pesticides than people who don't. And it turns out, just like you and I might differ in the way we break down or metabolize drugs, you and I might differ in the way we metabolize or break down chemicals, pesticides. And then I think there's luck. So that's interaction. I think there's some luck or bad luck. And then finally, there's modifiers. Age certainly increases your risk. And if other conditions, diabetes can make your disease worse. There's a whole range of other modifiers that might, exercise, for example, diet, and things like that.
But if you were the third child, an Rh negative mom, and you're Rh positive, before they had the treatment for the mother's antibiotic.
So, so when a woman becomes pregnant, all of us have antibodies against different blood antigens, which are just proteins on the outer parts of cells. Pregnant women sometimes will have different blood types than their child, and therefore might produce antibodies against their child's blood type. I'm unaware of any strong evidence linking that to Parkinson's disease. I could be missing something, but I'm unaware of it.
Oh, we can do a study of that.
We just have to see what the rates are.
I'm the Rh positive.
Yeah.
Third child of an Rh negative mom.
Yeah. I just don't know. I mean,
I'm 78. I've had it for 50 years. I think.
I just don't so you want to that these chemicals all have a common, they all act similarly. So what do these chemicals all have in common? What do pesticides, dry cleaning chemicals, and air pollution have in common? They all damage the energy producing parts of cells called the mitochondria. Why is that important? Well, your brain's only 2% of your body weight, but 20% of your energy consumption. It is gas guzzling. It likes glucose and it takes glucose and it converts it into energy all the time. And the gas guzzling part of the brain is actually the nerve cells. And the nerve cells that guzzle the most amount of energy are those dopamine producing nerve cells, among the most. The dopamine producing nerve cells in the substantia nigra. If you stretched out that neuron in the substantia nigra, it would be 4 meters in length, twice my height. It has 1 million different connections and it's not insulated. So it has enormous energy demands. One of my colleagues, who's a pathologist, said it's like a big garbage bag and it's filled with jelly beans. And those jelly beans are mitochondria. And so if you give a mitochondrial toxin, whether that's paraquat, whether that's trichloroethylene, or whether that's air pollution, you're increasing your likelihood of damaging those nerve cells, especially in the part of the brain, the substantia nigra, that's affected in Parkinson's disease. So I like to look for chemicals or toxins that damage the mitochondria. That gives me some degree of confidence that those chemicals might be playing a role in the disease. Yes, ma'am.
Two parts. One, do you think we have genetic mutations? And two, if one person is exposed and develops Parkinson's, are they going through a genetic mutation like and if people are predisposed to it
So I'm going to do the first one. Have we identified all the genetic mutations? Answer is likely not. And there are certain populations that have been understudied. So it's like, for example, there's some recent studies in Africa that are finding new genetic mutations. Turns up in like the same gene, GBA, but the mutations, for example, in those populations might be different than the mutations in Ashkenazi Jews. Do I think we've missed the major ones? We've had about 35,000 studies of the genetics in Parkinson's. I don't think we've missed the major ones. So I don't think that 12.5% number is going to change very much. Like one of the most recent ones, I think accounted for 0.1% of individuals with Parkinson's disease. And actually, even that 12.5% number might be high because who are the people going to participate in the study of the genetics of Parkinson's? People who likely have more likely to have a family history. So I don't think we've missed major ones. I could be wrong, but I don't think we've missed major ones. I do think we've missed and not identified genetic differences in how we metabolize these chemicals. And that could explain why some people who are exposed to the pesticide, for example, get the disease and why some don't. I know some of you remember like Plavix, for example, now you do a genetic test, or we didn't know about that some people are essentially Plavix offers almost no benefit to some individuals because of differences in the way we break down drugs. I think we probably still miss that. Now, can these chemicals lead to changes in our genome, genetics, that can be passed on down to subsequent generations? Let's make it that. I don't know for certain. In general, only about 15% of people with Parkinson's have a family history of the disease. And that's been true in the late 1800s and is true today. You know, almost every study is 15 to 20%. So there are some things called epigenetics, which you might have been touching on, which are changes not in the sequence of the DNA, which is largely held constant, but in modifications to the DNA that could be passed down. I have to ask Michael Okun. I don't think that's likely to be a major factor. I would say I think it's unlikely to be a major factor. I think the heart of the question is, can we prevent this disease from our kids from getting this disease? And I think the answer to that is almost 100% yes. And that's why we give you these recommendations. If they don't get exposed to these chemicals, almost independent of their genetics, it doesn't matter. They're not going to get this disease. GBA carries this genetic risk factor. The most common one is your lifetime risk of getting Parkinson's is 10%. So the most common genetic risk factor, 90% of people with the most common genetic risk factor, so about 8% of that 12% is due to the GBA. Your lifetime risk of not getting Parkinson's is 90%. So if those individuals don't get exposed to pesticides, don't get exposed to dry cleaning chemicals going to air pollution, I think they're very, very unlikely to get the disease. Zoom audience question.
Yes, one more time, Ray. The question is considerations for children who may be at risk of inheriting Parkinson's gene.
So,
I want you to say it again.
So yes, so let's do GBA, the most common genetic. So we said that PD generation, 12.5% of Americans carry a genetic risk factor, genetic cause or genetic risk factor disease. About 1 to 2% is purely genetic. It doesn't matter what your environment is, 1 to 2% purely genetic. Those purely genetic forms, they have 2 bad copies and 2 mutated copies, altered copies of the gene. So if you're a child of that person, you're only getting 1 copy from that parent and presumably getting a normal copy from another parent, unless a lot of inbreeding or you get unlucky. So that's that. The most common genetic cause of Parkinson's disease is mutations in the gene called LRRK2, LRRK2, just spells it out. And that gene is you have a 50-50 chance of passing that on to your children, and you only need one bad copy to have that. If you carry that genetic cause, you have a 30 to 40% lifetime risk of
Is
developing
that
Parkinson's.
the Cartesian kindred in Italy?
Oh, we'll get to the Italy in a second. So that LARC2, so even the most common genetic cause, the majority of the people with the most common genetic cause of Parkinson's will not develop the disease. The majority of the people with the most common genetic cause of disease will never develop Parkinson's. Now, if I carried LARC2, I would be like, about what chemicals I'm getting exposed to, right? Because I am going to be like not wanting getting exposed. I do not want that gene to manifest in Parkinson's. Then Bob was saying there's, well, I'll just do it. Then GBA is the most common genetic risk factor. About 8% of individuals carry that, and the lifetime risk is 10% for those individuals. You have 50-50 chance of passing that on to your children. And there it appears that pesticides, that people who have GBA are especially sensitive to pesticides, and that might heighten their risk. So for the vast majority of people with Parkinson's, genetics plays a small part. Bob highlights this other family in Italy and stuff, which had mutations in a gene called alpha-synuclein, which is a protein that's misfolded. That genetic cause is really rare, like 1 in 10,000, if that.
Is that what they put in mice now to make it?
Yes, so that's when you want to give mice Parkinson's disease, you can mutate their genes. We had a, I think, yes, sir.
Yeah, if pesticides they cause Parkinson's, would you expect golfers?
Go ahead.
Can we tell your story?
Go ahead. Sure.
You want to tell your story? You want me to tell your story? Can I read your story?
You can read my, sure,
We're going to read your story. Can I read the story? Read the story?
Yeah.
Okay. Read. So why am I here? Because Carl let me tell his story. So my thanks, Michael and I, the book is filled with stories. It is not technical. It is filled with stories.
good stories.
And the stories are individuals affected by the disease. So this is chapter 1's on pesticide, chapter 2's on indoor water pollution, chapter 3's on indoor air pollution, chapter 4's on outdoor air pollution. This is a section called 2 Green. Like most exercises, golf can be beneficial for individuals with Parkinson's. One small study even found that golf improved performance on a walking test more than Tai Chi and was more likely to be continued by those with the disease. A 2021 review concluded that regularly playing golf can lower the risk of falls in older adults with Parkinson's disease and demonstrates the potential to improve quality of life. However, we recently had to ask a more ominous question. Could living near a golf course increase the risk of Parkinson's? In 2013, 2 neurologists thought that question was worthy of investigation after they found that 19 of 26 patients in their cohort with Parkinson's lived within 2 miles of a golf course, and 16 of the 19 lived downwind. Beginning at age 10, Carl Robb, a tech entrepreneur, lived in suburban Charlotte, North Carolina, right next to the 13th hole of a golf course. If it rained, golfers would cross his family's white picket fence and take shelter under their covered porch. As a teenager, Carl was looking for a summer job and joined the golf course's God Squad. Every morning, he'd help redo the greens and repair divots on the course. He liked the camaraderie of the team and the opportunity to play tennis after work. At age 17, Carl's left foot started to twitch. Then he noticed that he dragged his left foot and that the wear on his tennis shoes was uneven. His voice became softer and family members would tell him to sit straight. Carl was concerned. In the year before the internet, he started visiting the library. He read medical books and became convinced that he had a brain tumor. He saw 9 different doctors over 6 years before being diagnosed with Parkinson's at age 23. Carl, a graduate of the University of North Carolina, was working in Washington, D.C. when he became an early adopter of online dating in the early 1990s. He began corresponding with a web developer at AOL. Their conversations were going well, and eventually Carl disclosed his condition. She was not fazed by the disclosure because Carl made her laugh. His future wife, Angela, later said, "I love the man, not the diagnosis." And so since we wrote the book, my colleague, Dr. Brittany Krasnowski, a geographer at Barrow Neurological Institute in Phoenix, and my colleague, Dr. Rodolfo Savica, a neurologist at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, did a study. And Rochester, Minnesota does a really good job of tracking new cases of Parkinson's disease. And Dr. Krasnowski, Brittany, mapped proximity to golf courses against the new cases of Parkinson's. And she found that individuals who lived within 1 mile of a golf course had a 126% increased risk of developing Parkinson's. 3 other studies have found that green space workers, workers like landscapers, gardeners, have an increased risk of Parkinson's disease. One study has found that green space workers have an increased risk of ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. And one study long ago of golf course superintendents found that golf course superintendents were more likely to die of neurodegenerative diseases than other occupations. I haven't seen anything on golfers per se, but that's what we have. Golf courses, as I was reading at dinner, because Carl was asking me the question, can use up to 80 times the amount of pesticides that's on the farm. One report suggested 100 pounds per acre of it. Some of the pesticides that are used on golf courses have been linked to Parkinson's disease. One of them, called chlorpyrifos, has been found on over half of apples in the United States. And the lab, chlorpyrifos, damages the dopamine, damages nerve cells that produce dopamine.
You said 146% more likely.
Doubling.
Than the other.
Than people who live 6 miles or more from.
So what's happening to all the home values, these fancy
I don't know. But this is all preventable, right? Do we have to use this much pesticides on golf courses? Can we use safer pesticides? Can we use less toxic pesticides? Can we spray less frequently?
Or do it by hand.
Can we do it by hand?
It was,
There's an infestation of a tree called Aleopsis subsistema. And the way we have to eradicate that is cut of a bird and just come back. It's using preventable. You familiar with that herbicide?
I'm not.
we were some question. So Bob.
Well, it kind of builds on what we're discussing.
Yeah.
Dr. Dorsey, what is the best option for spraying for pests in and around your home?
So
And I also will add schools, because that's mentioned in the Parkinson's plan.
So in the back of the book, if you're not a reader, we're sympathetic to you. Not everyone's a neurologist. Not everyone likes books. We give you the Parkinson's 25. So this is the Reader's Digest version. You can just go to page 237 and you can go to it. So I'm going to read you the Parkinson's 25. Here are 25 actions to lower your risk of Parkinson's. For those with the disease, some may even slow progression. Most apply to us regardless of age, sex, disability, or geography. These recommendations may be especially important for those with a family history of the disease. I forgot what my family history of the disease question was. Those at genetic risk and those who've been exposed to toxic chemicals. So it's pictures, right? Pictures. Short, nice thing. So it's pictures and very, very, very short. You can read this in 10 minutes. So were we asking about what to do in the home? I think that was the first question. So number 11 of the Parkinson's 25 is don't poison yourself. Sometimes the remedy is worse than the disease. Insects, including fleas, ants, and moths, can be unwanted guests. Unfortunately, some common pesticides can increase the risk of Parkinson's. For example, the pesticide permethrin found in flea collars, ant sprays, mothballs, and outdoor apparel can reduce dopamine-producing nerve cells in laboratory animals. Consider safer alternatives, and if necessary, minimize exposure by wearing a mask, increasing ventilation, open your windows, and avoid spraying your children. The seeds of Parkinson's are planted early.
For me, sir,
Yes.
the U.S. military uses that on their clothing.
Yes.
They put it on their clothing.
Yes, and it's also found it evidently in, I don't want to get outdoor apparel. I don't want to get anyone upset with me, but that's what it is. And I think someone asked about, can I do?
Sure.
Is there kids' schools? So, you know, but so pesticides are routinely sprayed on your kids' schools and playgrounds. we stop that? So California did. They did because a woman dropped off her 5-year-old kindergartner at Sherman Oaks Elementary School in LA. A guy in a hazmat suit, a man in a hazmat suit was spraying pesticides. Her kid had an asthma attack in front of her. He comes back to the car and goes, "Mommy, mommy, is this ever going to happen again?" And his mom, Robin Sewell, said no. Petitions the California legislature, which bans the use of most toxic pesticides on kids' schools and playgrounds, requires written notification in advance of any pesticide spraying so parents can protect their children. If we can do that in schools in California, we can do that in Fairfax, Virginia. We can call, anyone here can call the principal and say, "Can we stop using pesticides on the kids' playgrounds?" Call the school board. It's like playing with weeds. It's fine. It's better than getting exposed to neurotoxins. Yes, sir.
To build on that a little more, what are some other, I don't know, other countries or other jurisdictions you've seen, what are some policies that could be put in place to do that?
Yeah, so we can ban certain chemicals. So there's some paraquats, this weed killer. It's been sprayed on corn, cotton fields. It's sprayed in Virginia. It's probably being sprayed to, where are we? What day are we on? It's probably being sprayed today. And over 50 countries, including China, have banned paraquat, but the United States has not. The
I'm trying to get our
EPA.
General Assembly to ban it. They wouldn't even allow an educational brochure to the farmers how to clean up before they go back in the house. We have to change our government to make them aware that we're not going to put up with this crap anymore.
Yes.
They
Yeah.
tabled my resolution. They didn't even get a hearing
So
5 years ago, but maybe it'll change
yes.
in November 6th. We can change it.
So I was just on Capitol Hill today. I dropped off a copy of our book with Congresswoman Nydia Velazquez from California, who's introduced legislation to ban paraquat on multiple occasions. It would be nice if we joined many countries in banning it. Kids' playgrounds, we also need to think about where schools are located. Some schools are located near farm fields. And so my colleagues have shown that simply living or working near where paraquat is sprayed is associated with a doubling of your risk of Parkinson's disease. That pesticide that's found on apples is associated with intellectual disabilities. It used to be sprayed in kids' homes and in homes in New York City to kill insects. My colleague, Dr. Virginia Rao at Columbia University, found that pesticide in the umbilical cord blood of children born to women in homes in New York City. The higher that level of pesticide, the lower the IQ at 3, 5, and 7. And just last week, she looked at MRIs of these children as young as 6 years old and had abnormalities on their MRI that could be seen in the structure of their brain in children with higher levels of this pesticide. Is there a list of the book, or the book has so the book, chapter 10 is actually a plan to prevent the disease, learn why it starts, amplify the voices of those affected so people like Bob are heard, and to navigate the frontier of new therapies. And we give you 20 specific recommendations for things you can do as individuals, things you can do in your communities, get rid of the pesticides in your kid's school, and things we can do as society, get rid of paraquat. Yes, on Zoom, and then we'll come.
Further, question from the Zoom audience is, what about exposure to PFAS? Second part is me, how can we get tested, right? And what is the mechanism to get tested?
So first of all, about forever chemicals, PFAS, and then second, how can we get tested for these chemicals? So turns out that many of these chemicals, DDT, heptachlor, organochlorine pesticides, and chemicals called PCBs, which are widely used in electronics, they all have a very similar chemical structure. They all have, for those of you who remember high school chemistry, carbon bonds to like either chlorine or bromine or fluorine forever chemicals. Those are all in column 7. This is the halogens. You remember the inert gases like neon and this and helium. This is the column just to the left of it. And all these have bonds between carbon, that black atom, and these things. So they all have similar structures. Forever chemicals, I didn't have an answer to the question, so I emailed my friends and colleagues, Dr. Tim Greenemeyer, that's the word on Tim Greenemeyer, neurologist, neuroscientist of the highest order. He showed that chronic exposure to a pesticide called rotenone causes animals to develop Parkinson's disease. He did that research and showed that in 2000. 20 years later, he developed Parkinson's himself, likely from insufficient protection from himself from the experience he was doing. He's a fantastic guy. His story is in the book as well. I asked about these forever chemicals, and a wonderful colleague who's a neurotoxicologist who actually knows what she's talking about, Dr. Brianna Miranda. And they said there's one group that's studying it, but we largely don't know. I don't think someone asked if we identified all the genetic causes. I think we've likely identified all the major genetic causes. There are likely other chemicals beyond that, which we talk about in the book, but I think the trichloroethylene, because it was so widespread, so widely used, risk is so high. I think that's the major one, but I would not be surprised if there are others. And your second question is, can you test? And if you find these chemicals in your body, for example. And so everyone in here has lead in their blood because we had lead in gasoline and lead in paint. We got rid of in air. We got rid of lead in gasoline and lead in paint. And our kids have 95% lower lead levels than we do. 95% lower. So we can succeed.
How about mercury?
I don't know mercury, but our kids are smarter because of it. And it turns out we still might need to get lower levels lead still. I would love to measure these chemicals. So for example, people who live near golf courses, do they have higher levels of pesticides in their blood, their urine, or their hair? Their hair, Carl. In their hair. So you can sign up if you want to participate in these research studies. We have the Atria Brain Registry. Emily is right there. If you didn't sign in with her sheets on the way in, you can sign on the way out. And so you want to participate in our research studies. So you can participate in the Atria Brain Registry. And if you're online, we will send you a link so you can participate in it. And your second call to action, you all should join the PD Avengers. So the PD Avengers is a global grassroots organization formed by people with Parkinson's, not neurologists. These are people with Parkinson's disease and led by, not by neurologists, but by people with Parkinson's disease. People with the disease are the most effective advocates. Who's more compelling, Carl Robb or Ray Dorsey? I think the answer is Carl Robb. So if you haven't joined the PD Avengers, it takes 30 seconds to do. Use PDAvengers.com. It takes 30 seconds. It's free. There's no obligation. You can join whether you have the disease or whether you don't have the disease. And if you are old-fashioned and like paper and pen, if you just sign your name, your email address, and click yes, we will sign you up for you. You can do that today.
You mentioned earlier that from the chemicals, if a mother is a pregnant mother has chemicals and damaged mitochondria, that can be passed to the baby, right?
So some of these chemicals, if the woman is exposed to these chemicals before they have their children, some of these chemicals can be passed on to the baby. So for example, an example that chlorpyrifos sprayed in the homes in New York City, the women were obviously exposed. They had it in their blood, and then it passed to their children.
Do the children develop?
They're too young for us to know, but the study that just came out, they're like 16. They had slow motor function.
So was it the chemical, or that the chemical damaged the mother's mitochondria?
Well, the mother's mitochondria likely damaged, but likely the chemical it's not likely the damage to the mitochondria and the mom that's causing the problem. It's likely the chemical either passing through the placenta, passing in the breast milk, and getting exposed to the child.
Dr. Dorsey, so Agent Orange caused a lot of problems in Southeast Asia and all over the world. Wouldn't an incredible test bed be for the poor Vietnamese that spent their lives in Vietnam after we put hundreds of tons of Agent Orange on top of their villages? What happened to them?
So there's been one study looking at Agent Orange during Vietnam, which has been linked to Parkinson's disease. One story, General Colin Powell, and remember General Colin Powell, in 1963, he's in Vietnam, and he's dumping a more concentrated form of Agent Orange called Agent Purple over the North Vietnamese. As some of you might know, late in his life, he developed both Parkinson's disease and multiple myeloma, both those chemicals linked to it. There's been one study, I believe, in Korea that looked at the Koreans who were exposed to Agent Orange from being exposed. and they had higher rates of Parkinson's disease.
Not the Vietnamese people themselves.
I don't know if there's been a study of the Vietnamese people themselves. There have been lots of calls for additional studies of Agent Orange in Parkinson's disease. Those calls have not been heeded, and those experiments haven't been conducted.
There's a lot of moral injury there.
Yes, and so Senator Tom Daschle, some members, former Senate Majority Leader in Vietnam, served in the U.S. Air Force as an intelligence officer during the Vietnam War. And as a young congressman, he was the one who passed legislation that provides benefits and compensation to Vietnam veterans who got exposed to Agent Orange and later developed Parkinson's disease or other conditions. And so, I'm sorry, and prostate cancer.
20 conditions, a
Yeah.
lot of cancers, stuff I've never heard of.
Yes.
I had a question. We were discussing ingesting or breathing, air quality, but what about exposure to even cheap perfumes or sprays that.
So I got, so if you guys have questions I don't answer, you can email us at info@pdplan.org, info@pdplan.org. Michael and I read all the questions, and I think we got a question within the last 2 weeks from a man or a woman who was a hairdresser and was asking about exposure to the chemicals that are used in hairdressing.
Yeah.
I can't say for certain, so one, I'm a neurologist.
Well, and here's
And you can see what my hair looks like, so I'm not hanging
I
out.
remember a study that was done of occupations, and hairdressers were high in.
And so there's some suggestion that the chemicals used in hairdressing could, many of them have chemical class 3 long solvents, liquids in which things dissolve. And some solvents beyond trichloroethylene might carry a higher risk for the disease. So yes, I think there's reason to be concerned for certain occupations about exposure to these chemicals. Fragrances and other things, many of these things are not highly regulated by the FDA, for example. I forgot.
It's good know number 5.
Yeah. So,
Or even sprays that cover up sprays of
yeah, so we don't do a deep dive on it. There are lots of other people who've done deeper dives on that. I'll leave it to that. But I would say that chemicals, liquids that are used to dissolve other substances, industrial chemicals, trichloroethylene may not be the only solvent that plays a role. Yes, I'm sorry, Aaron, come over here. Yes, ma'am. Can I answer your question?
Oh, no.
Oh, good. For Parkinson's?
No, I mean,
Do they have high risk for Parkinson's? I have not seen that. So chemotherapy largely targets rapidly dividing cells, which is what cancer is. And so I have not seen that implicated in Parkinson's. Yes, ma'am.
The first one is, does anyone microplastics and Parkinson's? And the second one, they don't hear a lot about it anymore. So is there anything happening or we worried that it's going on?
Yes. So microplastics, one recent study suggested, I believe in laboratory animals, that microplastics could lead to Parkinson's. Microplastics have been found in blood vessels, like carotid plaques in the artery. One recent study found microplastics in the brain. Very early, so don't want to say too much, but are there other chemicals that could be contributing to Parkinson's disease? Yes, could microplastics be on it? Definitely worth investigating. So in 2024, Congressman Gus Bilirakis, Republican from Florida, Alfonso from New York, and Congressman Jeffrey Wexton from Northern Virginia, who disclosed that on World Parkinson's disease, I think in 2020, Parkinson's Day in 2022, 2023, disclosed that she had Parkinson's disease, only to find out she has a worse form of Parkinson's called PSP. introduced a bill called the National Plan to End Parkinson's Act, passed the House 407-9, unanimously passed the Senate, was signed into law by President Biden, requires the federal government for the first time to develop a plan to end Parkinson's.
But no budget.
No budget. The forward to our book is written by Congressman Gus Bilirakis and Congresswoman Jennifer Wexton. Tomorrow at Politics and Prose in DC bookstore, hopefully you all got the flyer. Congressman Gus Bilirakis, Michael Okun, and I, along with the former editor of Politico, will be at the Politics and Prose bookstore in Washington, D.C. at 7 o'clock. We want a full house. I want like standing room only because C-SPAN's going to be there, and you need to make your voices heard. You guys got to show up. The Parkinson's community, if they need to show up. Ali Signorelli says Parkinson's has a PR problem. So this is a great chance to change the PR notion by packing that room. So if you can't join us, tell your friends and family members in DC to come. It's free, no registration is required. You just show up at 6:55 and you come in and pack the room. And I thank Gus Bilirakis for getting this bill passed. Not much action has happened. It required for a federal advisory commission, including individuals with Parkinson's, to be part of this advisory council. Those members, to my knowledge, have not been selected. I spoke to one of the advocacy leaders for the Michael J. Fox Foundation. This is one of their 2 policy priorities at their policy forum September 9th and 10th. Some of you are probably going to that. So it's a time to make your voices heard. Listen, 1.2 million Americans have the disease. It's one of the world's fastest growing brain diseases. 250 Americans were diagnosed today with the disease. 100 Americans died with the disease today. Make your voices heard. Tell your legislators and representatives you want action to be taken on this. You want this bill, which was passed overwhelmingly from both houses, to be actually put into place.
It's worse than that. They're cutting off existing research. They're stopping funding to the NIH, to the universities that have ongoing experiments that are going down the drain right now.
So be
We're losing
constructive
our heads.
and make your voices heard. Show up tomorrow, 7 p.m. Politics and Prose, free. Don't need to register. There is no registration. You just show up. Emily's going to be there. She'll be having her sign out sheets. Enjoy the PD Avengers. Make your voices heard. End this PR problem with Parkinson's. The HIV actors had this wonderful motto. It was silence equals death. And for Parkinson's disease, silence doesn't equal death, but it equals suffer. And I hate Parkinson's disease. When I see Parkinson's on the streets in New York, I get pissed off because I know how terrible the disease is, and I don't know how much terrible it is as you do. I know it's a terrible disease, and I think it's all, the vast majority of it's preventable. It's needless, preventable, avoidable suffering. We should make it so that our generation is the last generation to bear the burden of Parkinson's, so our children and grandchildren live lives free of Parkinson's, just like we live lives largely free of polio. We can do the same thing for future generations.
We have a Zoom question?
Yes, can avoiding these chemicals now and even detoxing from them slow the progression of the disease if you're already diagnosed?
So I think the answer to that is yes. So if you're already diagnosed, so I'll give you an example. So if you're a smoker and you get diagnosed with lung cancer, what's the doctor going to tell you to do? If you're a farmer or a golfer and you get diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, what's the neurologist telling you to do?
Stop.
Take up bowling.
But they are not telling you anything right now, right?
They don't know.
So I think one of the reasons why some people have a slowly progressive course and one reason why some people have a more rapidly progressive course, one reason is that some people are still getting exposed to the toxicants. They're still drinking the well water. They're still on the golf course. They're still breathing in paraquat that's being sprayed on nearby farms. By the time you get diagnosed with Parkinson's, 60% of the dopamine producing nerve cells have died off. Protect the remaining 40%. Stop getting exposed. I'll give you an example. Within minutes of smoking your last cigarette, your heart rate drops. Within hours of smoking your last cigarette, your carbon monoxide level decreases. Within months of smoking your last cigarette, your cough and shortness of breath decrease. Within a year of stop smoking your last cigarette, your risk of heart attack diminishes. Within 10 years, your risk of lung cancer is half. So if you got exposed to these chemicals as a kid, if you grew up with well water, you want to really, 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 really take action now. And if you already have the disease, by goodness gracious, stop getting exposed to these chemicals. Not your fault, but take action to minimize your exposures and exercise. Those are the first two things you should stop being exposed to these chemicals, all forms, and exercise. Yes. Ma'am.
So you're
Okay.
telling me that tomorrow I have to go and tell all my privates that I have in my boxing class that play golf, and a lot of them do, that they have to stop?
Well, I don't know, stop doing golf because, there's some benefits to it, even in the
Right,
thing.
that's- yeah.
But I would tell them to all go call the grounds crew and say,
Alright.
stop staying and may not play on the day that they're spraying pesticides.
My golf course is too poor to use. They can't even maintain anything.
Yeah,
They don't spray because they don't have the money.
good. We got a question in the front row. I got one here, then I'll come back to you.
Doctor, I am very impressed with your passion on Parkinson's disease. And if it's not too personal, I'd like to ask the question, how did you become so involved?
Question, you got your question.
She got me,
Thanks.
yeah.
So, I like to say both my parents are psychiatrists. I rebelled and became a neurologist. And then Carl was going to ask me what's the best piece of advice I had. And then I did a little differently. I went to medical school and I went to business school and I worked for a consulting firm for a couple of years. I learned a lot, but I wasn't super passionate about the work I was doing. And so I went back to Philadelphia where I went to medical school and met my mentor, Steve Galetta, who was our program director, in charge of residency education. So if you're not passionate about what you're doing, you should come back to residency. You won't feel complete unless you do. You won't feel complete unless you do. I called my lovely wife at the time. We had 2 young kids. And I said, what would you think about going back to residency? And to her great credit, she said yes. And so that's what got me into neurology. And then I didn't know about all of this. Like Carl mentioned, I was really focusing when I was Parkinson's about improving care, trying to bring care accessible to everyone with Parkinson's. And I had the gift of a sabbatical about 8 years ago. And I spent that sabbatical reading. I like to read. And I read the work of my colleague, Dr. Caroline Tanner, who in my mind is this giant, but in reality, she's probably more than 7, maybe 5 feet. And she is about as nondescript and about as quiet as you can imagine. But for 40 years, she has been diligently telling us that Parkinson's, the principal cause of Parkinson's, are not in our genes, but in our environment. And almost all these studies I told you about pesticides, about trichloroethylene, about campylagine are all her work. And I read it, and I'm like, one, impressed. How come I didn't know about this? I had heard a little bit about pesticides, but I had never heard about trichloroethylene. She said, Ray, did you hear about campylagine? And like you, I said, nope. And then I started investigating, and the more I looked, the more I came back to Carl, and I tell him his story, and then I learned, and all of that's reflected in the book. And I come away really, really increasingly convinced that this disease is largely man-made. That this disease is man-made. Just like type 2 diabetes, or obesity when we were kids, right? There were very, very few obese children, classmates, just like a lot of autism. There wasn't 1 in 31 kids when we were in grade school did not have autism. A lot of these diseases, I think, are largely man-made or have man-made contribution. And if we change our behavior, just like we did with lead, we get rid of the disease. And wouldn't it be nice to live in a world largely free of Parkinson's? And I think that's eminently achievable. And we outlined 3 goals so that by 2035, that the rate of Parkinson's is no longer rising, it plateaus. 0% growth in 10 years. I think we can actually do that. That when you have me come back in 2036, when you're being your 50th year of Parkinson's, we'll be talking about the fall of Parkinson's. The fall of Parkinson's.
Thank you.
We're going 15 minutes left. So
One question, how far is the adoption level of the general medical community of your theory?
So one, I don't think they're theories. They're evidence. So we give you 60 pages in the back of the book references. We tell it in stories because you guys don't want to hear the science, right? But
Sure.
if you want the science, we got 60 pages of reference. Dr. Caroline Tanner has done this for 40 years. 40 years.
Yeah, no, I totally get it.
I think we weren't taught this.
Yeah.
We were taught in medical school that things were either genetics or aging or bad luck.
Okay.
Diseases have causes. That's the principle of the Western philosophy. Diseases have causes. It's not divine retribution. You didn't get Parkinson's for some divine retribution. You got Parkinson's because you got exposed to some chemicals, and that exposure was likely involuntary and likely weren't told about it. And I think we should stop getting involuntary exposures that we don't know about and aren't told about. If we stop these involuntary exposures, we get rid of the disease. And I think we write this book for you because you are the people who will change the course. It will not be neurologists. The people who led mothers that fight against drunk driving were not trauma surgeons.
Yeah.
The people who led polio were not infectious disease experts. The people who led HIV were not infectious disease experts. They were people who were directly affected. Don't look to us to change the course of diseases. You guys will change the course of disease, and we're happy to follow along.
But the research now is going more towards.
You know, even since we wrote the book, these studies have come out.
Right, yeah. Exactly.
But there's a devil's advocate, okay? In Barcelona, there was a guy who got an award for being an advocate. He had a woman, maybe it was his mother, in a remote village that they weren't using much of anything. It came down with Parkinsonism. She was thought to be a witch. So it does develop in places that aren't proven, maybe, right?
Well, listen, there's stigma all around this,
No,
but
I
we
mean,
don't.
this woman got Parkinsonism without being on a golf course.
So I don't know. Listen, like,
Not well water.
I can't explain why every single person has Parkinson's disease.
So it's not
Well,
absolute.
something we haven't discussed. What about head sports? Sports. If you knew what you know now, would you allow your kids to play football?
Not tackle. No. And so there are. You guys remember Brandon Chastain, the woman soccer player who won 2004, beat China, took for Jersey to celebrate. So she's very concerned about the effects of heading soccer balls, and so even not just football. Her colleague Michelle Akers said, you know, the idea that you're going to head a ball that's coming from 50 feet in the air may not be the best thing in the world. So I think we can get rid of head trauma. I think it's almost self-evident. I am concerned about football. I'm concerned like UFC and other things. I think, you know, we can wake up and learn
Just
from
for
mistakes.
correlation, the longer you're playing football in college, the higher your risk for Parkinson's. That's an observational.
There's 10 minutes left. Okay.
Zoom.
A Zoom question.
Yes, we have a question. This is more on the treatment side, right? So, we haven't talked much about treating the condition. Obviously, I didn't see Michael Okun kind of stuff that came in. So, but I know you're a treating neurologist as well. So, can you talk a little bit about REM behavior disorder and the impact of that?
So REM sleep behavior disorder is very common in Parkinson's, especially that got the first form of the disease. It can be an early feature of the disease, and other individuals can be a late form. When you're dreaming at night, you normally are paralyzed. Like when you pick up your kid, you know, that baby, and the baby doesn't move, it's like, it could be during REM sleep. And so we're actively dreaming during REM sleep. The EEG with brainwave activity looks like we're awake. So if we're being chased by the lion, we're doing that in our brain, but we're not acting it out. That paralysis is lost during REM sleep behavior disorder. So that partner might strike across when they're fighting off the lion, might strike their bed partner. So REM sleep behavior disorder can be an early feature of the disease and can be disabling. There are ways to treat it. One is to put a pillow between them. My favorite one from someone with Parkinson's is sleeping in a sleeping bag. So you can still sleep next to your spouse, but you can't hit them. Sometimes spouses have to separate the things, and then there are medications that can be used. The plan is to prevent the disease, learn why it happens, amplify the voices of those affected, like everyone in this room, and navigate the frontier of new treatments. Chapters 8 and 9, largely written by Michael Okun, discuss what are the most promising treatments in the near term, like pumps, what are the most promising treatments in the midterm, like perhaps gene therapies, and what are some of the promising therapies a little bit longer out, like nanomedicine.
So, would you recommend if someone is having a care partner and having issues with their loved one with REM sleep behavior disorder, that they really need to work with someone, a neurologist closely?
Yeah, and so there are non-pharmacological interventions, and if it's problematic enough, there are medications like melatonin and clonazepam that can be considered.
somebody asked you a question about the involvement of the vagus nerve and Parkinson's. Can you
Yes.
Talk a little bit more about that.
So the vagus nerve, again, this nerve that goes from the lower part of the brainstem. So you have the brainstem, and the spinal cord. They're all contiguous, right? They're all connected. And so the vagus nerve enters from the lower part of the brainstem, and it innervates our heart, and innervates our gut, and innervates many of our other organs. And it appears that chemicals that enter in our gut can lead to misfolding of alpha-synuclein, the protein that's implicated in Parkinson's disease. And that misfolded protein can spread from nerve cell to nerve cell. Remember, we talked about those transplanted stem cells that got pathology in it. And so how do you get from the gut to the brain? Well, the highway from the gut to the brain is the vagus nerve. So again, like, it can be 2 feet. Maybe my vagus nerve might be 3 feet in length. And that misfolded protein can spread in that nerve cell and then spread upwards from the lower part of the brain to like the midbrain where the substantia nigra is, and cause pathology there. And when you get misfolding happening there, you get damage to nerve cells there. Then you get tremor and slowness of
Like
movement.
mad cow disease.
Kind of like mad cow disease.
Doctor, in advanced Parkinsonism, besides the death of the dopamine producing neurons, what about the receptor cells? Are they affected too?
I
Some
don't.
people, the medicine doesn't work anymore because the receptors are gone.
I think that late in the course of Parkinson's disease, medication appears to lose its effectiveness. Now, over time, as the nerve cells continue to die off, you need more and more medicine. So what are you going to do to prevent dying off? Stop being exposed and exercise. Stop exposures. Exercise so that the nerve cells don't die off. But they do die off. You need higher and higher doses of medicine. And late in the course, there may just be insufficient nerve cells for the medicine to work, because the levodopa has to be converted to dopamine. So it appears, for reasons that are still unclear to me, that late in the course of the disease,
Are we sure?
way past your time.
Are we sure? Are we sure that those cells die off, or are they dormant?
Well, so there might be damage.
Mhm.
Some might be damaged, and they may not be irreversibly damaged. And so, like, I think like the lung remodels, and we've learned that the brain has more regenerative capacity than we once thought,
Mhm.
and that a nerve cell damage may not necessarily, we can retain it. And so exercise, for example, releases growth factors that might be protective to it.
To replace the we have a lot of nerves. We have a lot of neurons. They're not all dead.
I'm gonna let Michael Okun answer that. The parts of the brain, like the substantia nigra, might be hard for new nerve cells to get there. It's unclear that there's regenerative capacity there.
But somewhere else.
Other parts of the brain, there appears to be some regenerative capacity.
Rewiring the brain.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
That's good. My wife tries to wake me up. That's good.
So sometimes it can be hard to awaken an individual. So that's hard. If I won't give medical advice, but if people are getting hurt, people get hurt. You got to put pillows. If that isn't doing anything about the sleeping bag, if that's not doing it, separating the bed are ways to do it. If that's not, then medications can be generally quite effective. Melatonin is what I like to use first because it has fewer side effects than clonazepam. Low doses, less, and exercise, stop being exposed, and then.
We have 5 minutes left.
Yes, ma'am.
Going back to the medical school question and educating the medical community, why aren't we being prescribed? And where's all this new knowledge? But the people in rural communities who don't have access to an MDS, they don't maybe have access to oncologists. And I know I went through my own frustrations of going to 3 different neurologists just to get a diagnosis. Even though I haven't been. And then the first reaction is, well, here's some pills. But where's the education about the importance of exercise, and why isn't exercise a prescription
Because insurance will pay for it.
So,
But why are we pushing?
yeah, so only 9% of people with Parkinson's see a Parkinson's specialist like Michael Okun or me. Only 50% see a general neurologist and 40% don't see a neurologist of any kind. Those people who don't have worse health outcomes.
I saw 9 different doctors over 6 years before I got diagnosed, and I was 23.
And so
9.
And so Michael in chapter 6 or 7 outlines a new care model for Parkinson's that puts the patient at the patient's the sun at the center of the universe, and everything should rotate around the patient's needs, and the caregiver's Mercury can get a little bit hot. And so we need new care models, and care is hard to scale. Like, I can only care for 1% one time. But why can't education be freely available? And so Bas Bloom, our colleague, created something called Parkinson TV in the Netherlands, which was used to be a live TV show, I think, in the Netherlands, Tuesdays at 8. And he talked about various things, including exercise. And we created something called Parkinson TV with Bas in the United States to make educational content freely available. I think we need to come up with better ways to educating people with the disease, independent of physicians, because that's really hard to access. There's only about 600 of us in the US, and there's 1.2 million. But there's this good book called Upstream, and it talks this analogy. I think it's from indigenous populations, and bodies are coming and being found in a river, and they're damaged, and they're hurt, and they take them out, and they set up, almost little hospitals and little clinics to take care of all these bodies that keep coming down the river, until someone decides to look upstream and see what's happening. Why are these bodies coming in? And that's what we're trying to do in the book, is go upstream and to prevent this, so that future generations don't have to do it. Like, we don't think about polio. We don't cure polio. We just don't have polio. We don't have smallpox. We don't have any of this. And I think we can get rid of a lot of this disease by just getting rid of these chemicals. But in the interim, we need to come up with more effective ways.
We have 1 minute left. Isn't also the problem making the diagnosis of Parkinson's and not until the symptoms are really there. It's like 5. It used to be you had to have 5 different symptoms. Yeah.
So there are increasingly efforts to identify the disease earlier. Many of you know my colleague Dr. Andrew Sideroff has identified markers in the spinal fluid that can identify it. There are tests of the skin. There will likely be tests in the blood in the coming years that will help facilitate the diagnosis of disease, and we'll learn more. But I'm looking forward to the day where we just don't have it. That in 2035, that the rise of Parkinson's stops. 2036, we start talking about the fall of Parkinson's disease, and that will say that it began here in Fairfax, Virginia.
And it starts with the Parkinson's plan.